Good evening, everyone. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I am director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and I will be your host tonight. I am here with you in the flesh, but really in the spirit with us, far more importantly, is Caitlin Mercer, the Associate Director of the Journalist Fellowship Program, and Mira Salva, the former Director of the Journalist Fellowship Program, who's worked very hard with this cohort of fellows on all their impressive projects. Tonight is the 2022 Summer Showcase from the Institute's Fellowship Program, a night on which we share just some of the many, many insights and conversations that we have hosted at the Institute with this amazing group of journalists from all over the world. Tonight we will hear 12 different presentations, some of them here in person, a few of them joining us online in a sort of sign of our times. And they will talk very briefly and intensely about some of the things that have filled our hours of conversations at the Institute, about finding purpose in one's work, about loss and the mourning of lost heroes, about what it means to do journalism in a context of disease and conflict and violence, and about some of the things that inspire them, whether it's technology or new ideas. And we hope that all of you will find this as inspiring as we have at the Institute. First up, we have Robyn from the UK and Maurice from Kenya. So please, welcome to stage.
Journalists around the world have a similar idea why we do what we do.
Despite being from entirely different countries, we have a shared and intuitive understanding of what journalism is and should be. You could say we're so in sync, we finish each other's
stories. But spending time at the Reuters Institute has led us to examine the purpose of journalism.
What is journalism? What is it for? And why do we do what we do?
These names, Michael Minor, Vincent Owide, and James Mreithi, might not ring a bell to many Kenyans. But to their friends and families, the year 2020 left a big scar. Though living in different parts of Nairobi, the three have three things in common. They're all young men, they all lived in an informal settlement, and they were all victims of police brutality. Vincent suffered a massive head injury. Michael was clobbered on the head and lost his eye, and James lost his life to 3 bullets fired by a police officer. The ugly reality as to why their names might not ring a bell to many Kenyans is that police brutality in the informal settlement has been normalized, and their stories were not covered by the media.
Meanwhile, 7,000 kilometres away in Leeds, West Yorkshire, my job could not be more different, right? Well, reporting on the north of England for The Guardian involves speaking to lots of people who have never spoken to a journalist before. One of those is Simba Mujakachi. I first spoke to Simba in September last year after I was tipped off about his plight. Simba was just 29 years old in June 2019 when he suffered a catastrophic stroke that left him comatose. When he awoke, he was paralysed on his left side and unable to talk or eat. His stroke could have been prevented by relatively inexpensive medication for a blood clotting condition that, as a refused asylum seeker, he was not entitled to on the NHS. Despite having lived in the country since he was a child, Simba was given a £100,000 bill for his treatment and left permanently disabled. When I first spoke to Simba, who was originally from Zimbabwe, he was wary. Having never met a journalist before, he was concerned about how he might be portrayed in a country where the media has a bad reputation for reporting on asylum and refugees. But the interview went well. Though he still had difficulty forming words, he opened up about the enormous personal toll of 11 grueling years trapped in the UK's cruel asylum system. It was an impactful story, and I hoped it would prompt the Home Office to take a further look at his case. The article was published. I waited. And then, nothing. It made no difference. Life went on, and I came to the Reuters Institute. Then last week, an email landed in my inbox. After more than a decade of struggle, Simba had finally been granted refugee status and his NHS debt wiped. Though the Home Office didn't give reasons for finally approving Simba's application, he thinks my reporting made all the difference after all.
The families of James, Vincent, and Michael have no hope for getting justice. This is because until now, nothing has happened and no investigation has been done. So when I was doing a documentary about these three victims, I wondered if news coverage would have made a difference in their stories. This is because the very few police brutality cases that have been covered in the media, we have seen the police being arrested and prosecution being done.
For people like Simba, James, Vincent, Michael, and their families, the work we do has the potential to be life-changing. So it's hugely important we get it right.
So when we do this kind of reporting, the stories have the power to make the victims visible, put pressure on authorities to investigate, and put pressure on the judiciary to prosecute. We work in the only industry that gets better when things get worse. For many people, we are the silver lining in their darkest hour.
Our job doesn't guarantee change will happen. Sometimes that's simply impossible, no matter how many times we follow up. But we can provide windows into different worlds, evoke empathy, reveal different perspectives, and give people the information they need to participate in society and democracy.
This is something almost all of us have in common. Whether your job is to spend time talking to voters in the street, to track wildlife, or to cover a war zone, we all do one thing: tell
stories. Whether they change the life of someone like Simba or simply tell people about the injustice done to James, this work matters, always.
In July 2020, a Norwegian newspaper interviewed a Swedish woman called Åsa. She had been sick with COVID some months back, and now she was struggling with long COVID, lingering illness after the initial infection should have been over. And Åsa had a lot of symptoms. She had a fever, she had chest pain, she had stomach ache, burning skin, racing heart, shakes, back pain, swelling, diarrhea. She had problems getting enough oxygen, and she had problems concentrating. Åsa's story is a good example of how tricky it's been to report on the COVID pandemic for these last few years. You see, on the one hand, COVID is a new disease, and who knows what long-term effects it might be having on those who catch it. But on the other hand, a journalist should still verify their stories. Just because someone's illness started after they had COVID doesn't mean that COVID caused their illness, right? But how do you navigate that when you're sitting on Åsa's couch and you're listening to how miserable her life has been these last few months? How do you balance that empathetic presence in the interview situation with the need for journalistic verification? There are many ways of getting this balance wrong. Some journalists have asked questions then and there in the interview, which have been taken the wrong way, and the interview is just frozen. Others have had the interview and the relations go sour after the interview because they asked follow-up questions that were perceived as disbelieving. And yet others have done everything right during the interview and after the interview. But then the patient got devastated reading the article once it came out, because elsewhere in it, an expert said something that made them feel like they weren't believed. I think that the solution to this balancing act lies in how we think about patient sources in our stories. We should stop thinking about them as like the human angle of our stories and start framing them as experts on their own lived experience. That means, first of all, you prepare. So before the interview starts, we should say, I will be asking you some difficult questions right now. And it's not because I don't believe you, but it's because the readers will be wondering. Then you give them the opportunity to explain, which means you don't ask, are you sure that your problems were caused by COVID? But rather, why do you think your problems were caused by COVID? And finally, and most importantly, you confront. If you know that you're talking to experts who have a different view on long COVID or on any other topic, then tell the patient that and let them give their views and be part of that debate on their own premises. I don't really know what happened to Åsa, how she felt about that article that came out a couple of years ago, or how she's doing now. And I don't know if she was asked any of these kinds of slightly difficult, slightly probing questions, though it didn't appear so from the article. But I do believe that we should ask these questions. It might start some difficult conversations with our sources, but I think it might also make it easier for readers to trust their stories and, by extension, our reporting.
El diario in Spain often finds itself in an awkward position. Just as the evil queen in Snow White wanted the mirror to tell her that she was the first person in town, some subscribers to El Diario wish this media outlet to confirm their opinions and biases. They want a mirror that tells them how handsome they are, how smart they are, how beautiful and good their people are, and how evil the others are, the director of El Diario, Ignacio Escolar, told me. And if the mirror doesn't reflect what they want to see, they will try to kill Snow White. They will try to drop their subscriptions.
At News 24 in South Africa, we've just begun our subscriptions journey. Having launched a freemium model just 18 months ago, its initial success has been encouraging. For 2 decades, we were a free digital news publisher, operating from a normal share of a very small pool of ad revenue. And all around us, in that same time, many of our print colleagues were struggling, and many of them have since lost their jobs. But now there's been a break in the clouds. For the first time, through intelligent tools, the possibility of now knowing who our audience is and what they are reading beyond just simple page views is offering us new opportunities for our readers to start paying for our journalism once again. In many respects, this is the question of our times. Why should a reader accustomed to free news pay for my journalism? While some media outlets in the North embraced this question a few years ago and have successfully found a path out of the woods through what we now know as reader revenue models. But are there cautionary tales to learn from those who've walked this path for longer?
How can journalism take advantage of these opportunities without caving to pressure, even when it comes from subscribers? In other words, how do we avoid the Snow White mirror syndrome? When the money comes from advertisers, it is sound to maintain a wall separating the editorial and the commercial side of a media outlet. But that doesn't work with subscribers. Because if journalists and media outlets want to create thriving reader revenue models, they need to listen to their audience. They don't need a wall, but a clear path to get information flowing into the newsrooms. In this context, new lines need to be drawn to protect impartiality and editorial decisions.
By embracing this flow of information, newsrooms in the North have effectively evolved and adapted how they use data and insights to now assist their thinking. At the Globe and Mail in Canada, they have Sophie, an intelligent tool which can help them tell if a given story is likely to acquire or retain a reader. Sophie has helped this publication increase its registrations by 130% and its subscriber conversions by 51%. At The Guardian, they have OFAN, another tool which, among other things, can measure the engagement on a story relative to its word count. And at the FT, they have Lantern, their own tool which shines a light on the depth of a reader's scroll beyond a certain point, something which they call a quality read. These analytics tools are helping these newsrooms answer questions we just simply were not able to before. How can we improve the quality of the feedback we get on our stories beyond just a page view number? And why and when is the reader willing to pay for my journalism? To a journalist from the South, where this is all relatively new and recent, these models absolutely blaze a trail for those of us hoping to breathe new life and hope into our industry.
But journalists are used to being on the receiving end of pressures. It comes from politicians, from advertisers, and from anarchy actors of society. It was always a matter of how we journalists confronted that pressures without caving. The same now holds true when the pressure comes from subscribers. Even when information from audiences flow into the newsrooms, editors must still have agency over their decisions. To account for this, when necessary, resisting pressure from readers demands openness and transparency. After listening to any complaints from the audience, and if it appears to be a snow white mirror syndrome, newsrooms need to go back to their basics. They need to hold their ground and be prepared to defend and explain their work.
Ultimately, these reader revenue models and the data it is giving us is opening us up to a new world of income, one which may save our industry and many jobs in many regions. At News 24, we are now using Sophie 2, and some of these lessons we can learn from the North can help us on our journey in building and rebuilding a sustainable future for journalism in our country. Some of these lessons, which will be included in my paper, include a deeper dive into some of these tools, how we can use them and what they can say, as well as how do you build a data culture within a newsroom, some of which might include skeptical journalists. But at the end of the day, subscriber feedback, for the most part, comes from a good place. They pay for our journalism because they care. Sometimes they don't want to kill Snow White. Sometimes they just want to be heard. And we now have the tools to listen. Thank you.
A university student on her way to a friend's house. A woman from a village turned away by authorities when trying to report her abuse. A teenager who went to a study group and never returned. There are a few of the 1,627 women who are known to have faced sexual violence in Bangladesh in 2020. The real number is likely to be far higher. While most cases of sexual violence take up little more than a column on page 3, these women inspired mass protests in my country. Demonstrators came out to demand justice and to end the culture of silence that shames women for reporting their abuse. Bangladeshi news media covered these protests. It was the first time in my life that I saw reports on gender-based violence, not tucked away in the back pages, but on the front page of every newspaper, sometimes as the lead story. Yet, these are some of the headlines we printed during that time. Powerful images of women demanding their rights shared space with these tone-deaf illustrations. How did we get it so wrong? After I came to the Reuters Institute, I was alarmed, honestly, as a Bangladeshi, a little bit relieved to find that it's not just us. Whether it's British, Brazilian, or Indian media, journalists across the world are still sensationalizing stories, painting women as helpless victims in isolated incidents, and failing to talk about the systemic inequalities that lead to gender-based violence. Out of every 10 stories written on this topic, 7 to 9 are still reinforcing gender stereotypes or failing to challenge them. How do we make this right? Our journalism needs to be survivor centered. It needs to be trauma informed, and it needs to make clear that gender based violence is a human rights violation and a public policy issue. And we don't need to figure this out on our own. There is a wealth of resources already available on this topic. The only challenge left is winning the will to change from those in power. Gender diversity in newsrooms, particularly at the top, leads to gender-sensitive news judgment, yet only 21% of top editors are women. At the current pace of change, it will take us another 67 years to achieve representation in newsrooms. We have the tools, the language, and the way to manage change that will contribute to the fight against gender-based violence. One question remains: how much longer are we willing to wait?
Children usually look up to superheroes like Superman and Batman, but as a child, my superheroes were Al Jazeera reporters Walid Al-Umari and Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen was one of the first female Arab reporters and one of the most powerful women I knew as a child. Growing up in Palestine during the Second Intifada, we didn't watch the cartoon. Too distressed to watch anything but the news, we tuned our TV almost exclusively into Al Jazeera. So Shireen was present in every Palestinian household. She was the voice that exposed to the world the horror stories of our life in Palestine. Her courage and composure filled us with a sense of calm. She inspired me. Her antics offering a distraction during the night raids when I would hold my mother's hairbrush and pretend to be reporting the latest happenings in the neighborhood. It was my coping mechanism as a child, my way of dealing with the horrifying situation. It helped to deaden the fear. She was a true role model that an entire generation looked up to, and one of the reasons I found my purpose in journalism. As I grew up, my dream to become a journalist grew with me. And whenever I felt a sense of despair consuming me as a Palestinian journalist, I think of Shireen. If she can do it, I can too. However, a few weeks ago, on the 11th of May, Shireen was preparing to report on an Israeli raid on Jenin when an Israeli sniper fired a bullet into her face and killed her instantly. Her murder provoked outrage throughout Palestine. The pain of her loss was collective. All Palestinians, regardless of religion or political affiliation, mourned her together. And for me, a Palestinian journalist who looked up to her and felt empowered by her mere existence, I felt like I had lost a part of myself. A few weeks later, Israeli soldiers killed another Palestinian female journalist in my home city of Hebron. Her name was Ghufran Warasna. Israel has killed at least 47 Palestinian journalists since 2000. We have long been subjected to various human rights violations by the Israeli regime, including arrests, physical attacks, barring from covering, destruction of equipment, and more. And yet, no one has been held to account. All these brutal measures are a systematic approach that aims at nothing but silencing the Palestinian voice. But for us, Palestinian journalists, this job is more than just a career. It's a duty to tell our stories. Shireen once said, "It might not be easy to change the reality, but at least I can bring Palestinian voices to the world." So they may have killed Shireen, but they will never kill her message.
Sometimes I forget how big my country is. This is Indonesia. Living on more than 70,000 islands, the Indonesian nation today counts some 278 million population, comprising over 300 ethnic groups with their own languages and dialects. The Indonesian coat of arms carries the motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which means unity in diversity. All the contrast in cultural diversity is also reflected in the contrast of the inequality of economic, infrastructure, and human resources, especially in education sector within 3T region, frontier, outermost, and least developed regions. For those who live in the border areas, education is luxury. Their dreams is only as far as going to the city when they grew up. Just like children who lived in Kabuna village, East Nusa Tenggara. They are only 5 minutes away from the local airport, but still using candles to study because they have no electricity.
Harapan saya adalah bahwa semua anak itu berhak mendapatkan kesempatan yang sama gitu ya untuk pendidikan, untuk kesehatan, dan itu adalah sebenarnya tanggung jawabnya pemerintah gitu.
I share that same hope, and so I spent my fellowship asking this question. What can the media do about it?
These days, online education is quite important. Everybody agrees with that. So we provide lots of content, whether it's not just on TV, but online. So each grade, each school year, and each subject, almost every subject, content is made for online distribution.
Although it can't be seen as apple to apple, EBS proved that public media can contribute in education. The Indonesian Ministry of Education has their own online television program, but is troubled with the unequal distribution of technology and internet. The additional quotas program they launch is also not enough to cover these huge disparities. OSG is the first online scholarship competition in Indonesia, held by news and video site medcom.id.
Tujuan kita mendirikan ini murni ingin memberikan kontribusi pemecahan masalah terhadap masalah yang paling pelik, yaitu pendidikan. Masalah pendidikan itu macam-macam, banyak sekali. Tapi kita tidak pengen masuk kemudian mengkritisi, tapi kita pengen memberikan solusi. Lahirlah online scholarship competition ini.
Journalism serves as a witness to the event happening within our societies, but the media we work in can also pivot to become a learning tool to inform, educate, and engage young people in education. The hope for these children is there. The technology is there. I hope my documentary create the will to explore new solution for Indonesia.
It was April 2020. We were in the thick of the pandemic. As a freelance journalist, I was frantically pitching story ideas on the coronavirus from my home in Bangalore, where we were under lockdown. As a reporter extensively covering disability rights, I found that stories of frontline health workers left out the perspectives of doctors with disabilities who are more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Knowing well it was important to be reported, I pitched it to several international publications. An editor from a top global health publication reverted with feedback. I opened their email with bated breath, wondering if this could be my opportunity to bag my first byline with them. In front of me was a message I hadn't imagined would come from an international publication that proclaims to be diverse and inclusive in its reporting. We are going to pass, the email read, adding that it is hard to understand how people who, as you describe, can barely walk or use their hands are able to practice medicine. I was aghast. Yes, people who cannot use their limbs to full capacity can still use their minds. They can be physicians and are practicing, even in your country. I wanted to scream back, but I didn't. I could see a pattern here, a pattern of ignorance, lack of empathy, and a resistance to understanding someone different from them. I'd seen enough of it throughout my career, and how then discrimination stems from this resistance. I moved on from this publication and continued reporting on disability, realizing that this inability of newsrooms to understand people with disabilities and poor coverage, often perpetuating negative stereotypes, is directly related to the absence of disabled journalists in their newsrooms.
Underrepresentation happens in different ways, and I'll tell you some quick stories. Once, a co-worker asked me if I thought if he was black or not. I know, it may sound weird to you, but believe me, in Brazil, this is a thing. That's because he had never had to think about it until he started working in a newsroom where most of people were white. And when I say majority, I really mean it. A survey of journalists from all over Brazil shows that at least 77% of them identify themselves as white. And our newsroom was no different from that. Just for context, I'd like you to understand that the Brazilian population is composed of at least 55% of people that identify as black or brown, and just 43.2% identify as white. For my project, I heard reports of people developing mental health issues and even suicidal thoughts because they were constantly in a hostile environment in the newsrooms. Clearly, something is wrong with the way the newsroom receives these professionals. They don't feel like they belong, and this affects them and consequently the journalism that is produced. Once a colleague asked me how I felt being the only black person in our newsroom. I replied that I thought that was normal, which was true at the time. I didn't think it could change, but now I am determined to at least make the conversation happen properly in our workplace. My interviewee said that due to the lack of diversity, Brazilian journalism reproduces stereotypes during its coverage, acting as gatekeepers for a certain demographic group. Also, when it is escalated to management positions, it results in an overall disinterest in hiring different people for the newsrooms. I even heard stories about articles being labeled as activism, just because they featured only Afro-Brazilian sources, a comment that would never happen with an all-white sources article, for example.
For my fellowship, I've dug into the barriers for disabled journalists in Indian newsrooms. Basic infrastructural accessibility in newsrooms, low awareness about disability among co-workers, and inflexibility to rework processes to include everyone are just a few of the many. I know that making newsrooms accessible and implementing accessibility in news may seem daunting, but if publications could make it a goal and execute one thing at a time, soon there will be a time when everything they do will be the accessible way, and they'll know no other way to do it. I'm optimistic.
And as for race solutions, there is some hope also. The conversation is already happening, and the younger generation is more vocal than ever. The scenario may change sooner than we think. Thank you.
On the first Saturday of December last year, protesters swarmed the building of my newsroom, the ABC in Melbourne, and they were held back by a cordon of police who were guarding the door as they chanted "liars" and "tell the truth" to the journalists who were trapped inside. Now, this was the culmination of months of anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine protests in our city. Some of those protesters had legitimate grievances, but others were convinced that COVID was a hoax, that it was no more severe than flu, that masks were unsafe, that vaccines were unsafe, and that hydrochloroquine or ivermectin were cheap and effective cures. And all were united in their belief that we in the media were actively covering up these truths. How we responded to misinformation and how we prevented it from taking root in the first place was the subject of so many conversations in our newsroom in the past 2 years. Those early months of the pandemic were a crash course in science literacy as we debated flattening curves and reproduction numbers and case fatality rates and epidemiological modelling. How well we conveyed this science to our audience, and we were grappling with it ourselves, would have a direct impact on how far the virus would spread and the damage it would do. Unfortunately, once false or misleading beliefs take hold, they are extremely difficult to correct. In the words of the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, faced with the choice of changing one's mind or proving there's no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof. We do know that fact-checking has some positive impact in correcting misinformation, although it is more difficult in highly polarised situations, which the pandemic undoubtedly was. We also know fact-checks are most effective when they offer an alternative causal explanation for the false information and when we reduce the partisan and ideological cues in the way that we report science. And as journalists, we have to get the science right in the first place, even when it is evolving at lightning speed. That means we need to explain scientific uncertainty. We need to explain the limitations of research, the boundaries between what we know and what we don't know, so that when that scientific advice changes, and it did on masks and airborne transmission and the blood clotting risks of AZ, for example, the audience can see it for what it is, which is the self-correcting nature of science at work. And despite that minority who protested against us, I think we can take heart that the pandemic also saw record audiences for in-depth explanatory science journalism, that public broadcasters like the ABC remain highly trusted, and that in a time of crisis, people sought out these trusted sources of news and information like never before.
Storytelling has always been an important way to share information. Nothing is better than hearing a good story that you cannot wait to share. And that's what podcasting is too, is sharing stories. But in order to get your stories heard, it is essential to plan your audio well.
Here are the 5 things you need to think through when planning a podcast series. Number 1 is a goal. Why are you doing your podcast? You would actually be surprised how many start making a podcast without actually thinking, why are they doing it? So start your podcast planning like any other planning. Set yourself a goal.
I'm a radio host. For many years, I have worked as a radio host. And we know that sometimes we are just voices in your background. But in a world of mobile phones, audio is something new. Imagine someone walking, scrolling on their screen. The gaze is directed downwards. Now, imagine someone walking while using their headphones, listening to a podcast. The gaze goes forward and it goes around.
Number 2 is the listener. Why is the listener listening? After you set your goal, it's a good idea to think about the listener. Who's going to be listening and why? And what is the listener getting? Because the truth is, if the listener does not find your episode somehow valuable, they're not going to listen.
Our listeners are ready to look up. And that's good because we all have some screen fatigues at this point. But audio offers us that possibility. That is one of the many reasons for the growing consumption of podcasts.
The 3rd piece of advice is attraction. What is the thing in your podcast that's going to attract listeners? Either the host or the subject will work as an attraction for the podcast. So are you making a news podcast or is Michelle Obama your host? Either way, make sure that you know that you've decided on an attraction that keeps bringing listeners back.
A podcast is not an on-air product. It is an on-demand one. And as such, is better adapted to the needs and the preferences of an audience who is used to consuming media when they want. But that is not enough.
That's why number 4 is format. How do you present your content, your attraction? Does the format always have to be an interview? In a crowded market, a format is a way to stand out. So, plan how to showcase your attraction the best possible way and use your imagination.
Podcast is not a one-click product. It is a non-instant reaction content, as some authors says. As podcasters, we need listeners to stay with us. Podcasting, with its potential to share knowledge, to show us what's universal in individual experience, to share information, offers the possibility to meeting those expectations with almost no time or space restrictions. Podcasting may help us to expand and even to renew some journalistic genre. It can even bring new life into some of our most traditional sections, like the old police beat, translated and transformed into podcast, into the popular true crime genre. But we also know that format and content are not that separate aspects of podcasting.
So, number 5 is technology. How does your audio sound? Good sound quality equals professional. And bad sound quality is not so professional. We're talking about audio here, aren't we? In a world where the most of the listening is done by headphones, sound quality really matters. You don't want your attraction to sound bad or untrustworthy only because you've done mistakes with recording or editing. You have to sound good.
As good as possible. In times when attention is a scarce commodity, audio offers multiple resources to engage the audience and can drive a rich creative development into journalism. We have voices, we have historical records, we have music, sound effects, ambient sounds, and all that can be part of podcasting with limited costs. Journalism can expand its audience in podcasts, but it can only do so if we place listeners at the core of our work.
Six months ago, I don't know if I wouldn't have been able to tell you this whole story without breaking down. 6 months ago, I left my country because I felt overwhelmed. I wanted to abandon my career as a journalist and forget about all the problems that we lived through there. Armed conflict, poverty, inequality, crisis, displacement, pandemic were some of the words that were repeated in the stories that I used to write. As a journalist, we are trying to make content about what doesn't work in the world. Do you remember sentences like, good news is no news, or it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead? But I was wondering to myself, is that really true? During my stay at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, I discovered that it's not. And now it sounds like I'm going to sell you an anti-bullying product, but don't worry. I just want to talk about something simpler that helped me to think about journalism from a different point of view. Solutions journalism, a rigorous and complete reporting about the responses to social problems. And no, it's not about positive news or about land with the reputation of companies or organizations. Solutions journalism is a way out for journalists who, like me, are very tired of negative bias, but also who see how audiences are quickly drifting away. Let's be honest, who wants to watch, read, or listen to news that make us feel anxious? But convincing myself that solutions journalism will help me to continue working in storytelling, something that I'm deeply passionate about, wasn't easy. As a good journalist, I'm skeptical. So to prove that solutions journalism is really a solution, I decided to put it to the test. Proponents of this approach talk about how a good piece of solutions journalism should tell the whole story. But what does it mean? W, of what response does the solution address? H, how it works. O, offers insight. L, limitations. And E, the evidence of the impact. So I called 8 colleagues who have built spaces for solutions journalism in newsrooms in the Americas, Africa, and Europe to learn more about their experience and also to understand how each of these letters works in practice. They not only confirm that their life has changed, but also that they have massive audiences interested in interacting more closely with the media who have given hope just by balancing the scales. Of course, there's more to be said, so I invite you to listen to my podcast and I encourage you to implement this approach inside your newsroom. For the benefit of your audiences, of course, but mainly for the sake of your journalists.
Newsrooms and the journalists that work within them are often under threat, and not all of those threats are visible. Over the last few months, I've interviewed dozens of journalists and editors all around the world, working in places where their colleagues have been killed and where they're under constant surveillance, where leaks are viciously pursued by governments and where private companies aid them in those pursuits. And I've been asking them the same questions. If you can't trust your phone, what can you trust? As we learn more about the pervasive use of mobile phone spyware, it's becoming clear that nobody is protected. Nothing is off limits. The good news is journalists are adapting and they're finding ways to fight this. Some of those solutions are low-tech, using basic forms of code over encrypted channels to conceal their communications and make them more difficult to track, using pen and paper to make them more difficult to track, and even using old antiquated burner phones to make it harder to be targeted. Some of them are extremely high-tech, using iPods for dedicated investigations, using Tails, the incognito operating system, in new and innovative ways to protect sources. None of these solutions are perfect. Nobody claims to have it all figured out, but with the right types of skills in a newsroom, a path through the forest usually can be discovered. All newsrooms, absolutely all of them, need to understand these risks. The new newsroom of today needs to have experts in information security, they need to be training their staff, and they need to be vigilant.
So what does the newsroom of the future look like? In a word, it's multidisciplinary. This has, of course, been true for a very long time, maybe since the beginning of journalism itself. But the mix of disciplines is changing, both rapidly and too slowly. Newsrooms now have data analysts who look at audiences and their habits to better inform the stories we tell and the way we tell them. But they also have data analysts doing reporting on big data, running massive audience participation projects or explaining election results. Newsrooms also have, and increasingly need, designers and developers working together to tell complex stories, explain complex topics like encryption or climate change in ways that are engaging and interactive. Of course, there's still a big role for a simple, well-written yarn in journalism. But if we're not working to give the audience more than 600 to 800 words and a couple of pictures or an embedded tweet, can we really be surprised if they're starting to look elsewhere? The beauty is, with the tools that are already available, it's not too hard to get started. Well-designed and engaging data visualizations, charts and maps are within reach for anyone willing to have a play with tools like Data Wrapper or Flourish. And with the right mindset, these are mere gateway drugs to more technical approaches like Tableau or RShiny or even JavaScript. Bringing more technologists into the newsroom isn't just about production though. Concepts like computer-assisted reporting and data journalism and computational journalism have been around for quite a long time now. But the types of skills required to make the most of technology in the reporting process is changing very rapidly, much like technology itself. Data-driven forms of journalism and the programming and analysis skills it requires continues to move closer to the centre of journalistic practice. We see some of the best work emerge where technologists are embedded in small cross-disciplinary teams which include people with all the necessary reporting and production skills like research, design, writing, editing, animation and more. There's a world of difference between a newsroom that treats technologists as outside skill sets to be brought in when necessary and one where they're in the mix from the very beginning. As Paul noted earlier, technology is also central to the threats we face. All journalists need to think about the implications of our networked technological lives in ways that go beyond the production and distribution of our work.
So all of these tools that Simon and I have talked about are great. They're interesting, they're innovative, and when used correctly, they can aid and invigorate our journalism. But I've been thinking a lot over my time during this fellowship about what really matters to me in journalism and in reporting. And what I've been reflecting on, listening to all these fabulous people here in the room, is something that I think is far more important than any one tool or technique. And that's the J word, and not the painfully obvious one, journalism. The other J word, joy. Far too many colleagues, like Laura who you just heard, burn out. They crash, and these skilled reporters leave journalism altogether. I've seen it happen a lot. It almost happened to me. I've spent years covering Australia's immigration detention system, reporting on stories of abuse, of violence, and of harm. They're painful stories to hear, and like a lot of journalists, I wasn't really equipped with the tools to deal with them. I didn't have the language to talk about my own feelings. The moral harm that we experience telling stories of people caught inside vicious and impenetrable systems is real, and sometimes it's very painful.
These challenges and tools can feel quite daunting. But you know what? Seeing stories come to life can also be a real joy. I used to teach web development, and whenever anybody asked me what they needed in order to get into the job, I told them they needed three things. They needed the desire, and they needed vocabulary, and they needed a community. Well, desire should be really easy. We all already want to tell original, engaging stories, and vocabulary isn't too hard either. We're all already good at words, and it just takes a little bit of reading to extend that to new subject areas. We do that all the time too. Finally, community. Find like-minded people, both in your newsroom, where I know they exist, and in the wider community. Join a local Hacks Hackers group, or take a Night Centre MOOC and get to know the other students.
There's good news though. There is a way through all of this. It's possible to tell difficult stories about great darknesses, to take them in, to learn from them, to stay resilient and to experience joy. The greatest tool we have right now is language. The language to start talking about the big challenges we face. And when you look around this room and hear all these stories, how can you not be hopeful? Thank you.
We all know that it is an uncontestable fact that London is an amazing city, but I would put to you this challenge. Where else would you be able to go, even in a city like this, and find 16 journalists from 14 different countries who talk with such frankness and precision and with such a forward-looking attitude about the work that they do? I think it is a truly special community that we have at the Reuters Institute. And I want to thank all the journalist fellows that we have hosted these past months for the curiosity you've brought to the Institute and to your work, and that I know that characterize everything you do at home, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I want to thank you all for sharing your insight, your experiences, both the things that work well, but also those things that are difficult, your generosity, the kindness of spirit that you've all brought to the fellowship. And I want to thank you finally for caring about your work, but I think as importantly about the community, right? About the people who only together can do journalism. I think that is something truly special about the Institute, but also something truly special about the profession that all of you are in. So what I want to do now is to break with one rule that characterized the whole ethos of the fellowship and dominates the profession, which is that none of you have ever put yourself at the center of the story. You always put us, as the public, at the center of what you do. But just tonight, can we just for 1 minute make an exception and just invite all the journalist fellows to come and join me on stage here and be at the center of attention just for 1 minute. Please, come on up. So a huge thanks to all of you, this amazing community. A huge thanks to Philippa, to Juan, to Caitlin, and to Mira, who's put so much work into helping you do everything that you do, everything that you've done for one another, everything you've done for us. It's been a tremendous privilege to host you. I hate saying goodbye, but I'm really glad that we can do it in such a beautiful event together to really celebrate everything you have done and everything you will do tomorrow. So thank you very much for this. And everyone here, please join us for drinks outside after this. Thank you.